When you step into the halls of this Civil Rights Memorial site in Topeka, Kansas, the first thing that strikes your eye are two contrasting signs hanging from the ceiling. On the left, in big bold letters, one sign reads white. On the other, a now outdated term used to describe people of color. These signs are displayed here to remind visitors of a divisive practice that existed in 20th century America: racial segregation. Now, back then, these signs were actually not hung here at all. That's because in the 1950s, this was an all-black school, Monroe Elementary, one of the schools at the center of a landmark court case, Brown versus Board of Education. Like many places in the South, Topeka's primary schools were following a precedent by an 1896 Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Ferguson. It ruled that having racially segregated public facilities was legal as long as each facility was comparable to the other. It was a doctrine that became known as separate but equal. And when you look at Monroe Elementary, at least on the surface, its facilities did look similar to those at white schools. Take a look at these models of black institutions and compare them to their white counterparts. Both were built with similar material, had similar designs, and were alike in space and structure. And when you walk into the classrooms, you also get the sense that, again, on the surface, this school had everything it needed. The rooms were well built, the equipment was well maintained, and the teachers well trained. So by most accounts, things were up to standards physically, though not necessarily morally. At the end of the day, these places were still segregated, and honestly, for no sensible reason. It was just a racist practice. People all across the country, all across the world really, knew it was unjust and knew it had to change. So by the mid-1900s, one of the most prominent civil rights organizations, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, led a movement to challenge the system in court. It filed a lawsuit against the city's school board on behalf of local black parents whose kids were impacted by segregation. Among those parents was Oliver Brown, the named plaintiff in the Brown versus Board of Education case. His daughter, Linda Brown, was actually a student at Monroe Elementary, and like so many other African American kids in Topeka, she was forced to attend an all-black school, even though she lived much closer to one predominantly reserved for white students. That school was named Sumner. It's located here, in this tree-lined neighborhood, about 7 blocks away from where Linda lived. Today, the building is no longer in use, and it's largely neglected. But back when it was operational, Linda's father actually tried to enroll her here, but was denied. So, instead of going to this much closer building each morning, Linda was forced to travel a longer distance to attend the black school. And it was a pretty complex journey too. First, she had to walk several blocks and cross train tracks to reach her bus stop. When she got there, she still had to wait a little longer for the bus to arrive, sometimes in freezing temperatures. Then, when she eventually boarded the bus, it had to drive almost 2 miles, making frequent stops before it ultimately reached its destination, Monroe Elementary. And even when it arrived there, she often had to wait another 30 minutes or so until the doors opened. When the Brown versus Board of Education was heard in district court, other plaintiffs shared similar stories about what their kids endured. And the judges also heard from expert witnesses about the psychological impact segregation has on their children. One expert, an assistant professor of psychology named Louisa Pinkman Holt, told judges that the fact that segregation is enforced, that it is legal, has more importance than the mere fact of segregation by itself does, because this gives legal and official sanction to a policy which is inevitably interpreted both by white people and by Negroes as denoting the inferiority of the Negro group. It was a sensible argument, and when the judges later ruled on the case, they acknowledged that segregation does have a detrimental effect on black children, but they still decided to dismiss the case. They concluded that the type of facilities you see here at Monroe Elementary were comparable to the ones at white schools. And since the doctrine of separate but equal was still in effect, they couldn't find the law unconstitutional. Basically, it meant that the only way to end segregation for good was to challenge the separate but equal doctrine directly. To do that, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund appealed its case to an institution powerful enough to overrule it, the Supreme Court. When Brown v. Board was argued at the nation's highest court, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund wanted to make its case as strong as possible. So, they presented it along with 4 other civil rights lawsuits which they had previously filed in different parts of the country. So it wasn't just the lawsuit from Topeka, Kansas. They also argued cases from Virginia, Delaware, Washington, D.C., and Clarendon County, South Carolina, which actually may have been the most important one of all. That's partly because of the conditions Black students faced. This display gives you an idea of what things were like. You see here Black students going to school in a small, deplorable shack, while white kids had a much bigger and better maintained facility. When the South Carolina case was argued, they wanted to defeat the system of segregation together. They contended that segregation was a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution's 14th Amendment, and that the practice itself was harmful. To prove their point, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund called in expert witnesses. One of them was a researcher of psychology named Kenneth Clark. He, along with his wife Mamie, studied the ways segregation affects kids, and one of the ways they did it was by using, of all things, dolls. In their experiments, they gathered a group of Black children and presented them 2 white dolls and 2 brown ones, including this one here, currently on display at Monroe. And the kids were asked emotionally loaded questions about them. Questions like, which doll was the nice one? Which doll looked bad? And which one is a nice color? After many gut-wrenching sessions, the Clarks found that most of the children had an unmistakable preference for the white dolls and a rejection of the brown ones. They concluded that segregation was indeed hurting the self-esteem of Black kids and creating a feeling of inferiority. That conclusion, along with many others, was taken into account by the Supreme Court in 1952, when it started to weigh all 5 cases. At first, the justices were divided over how to rule on the issues, and they asked for another hearing the next year. By the time the case was re-argued in 1953, the court had a new Chief Justice, Earl Warren, who worked to bring the divided bench together. For the next few months, they carefully considered all the arguments against separate but equal, that it deprived students of equal protections, that it didn't always guarantee access to the same resources, and that, by its divisive nature, it stamped children with a badge of inferiority. On May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court issued its unanimous ruling. It found that students had indeed been deprived of the equal protection guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. Today, part of the text from that decision is etched prominently at Monroe, with the most memorable line reading, quote, "In the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place, as segregated schools are inherently unequal." It was a consequential decision that attacked segregation in a direct way, and it became a turning point in the long fight for civil rights. Now, it would be great to say that this immediately dismantled the racist Jim Crow laws in the South, but the reality was states kept resisting, partly because the court didn't explicitly determine how or when the ruling should be enforced. It wasn't until the next year, when the court issued a follow-up decision called Brown 2, that justices finally gave some sort of guidance, ruling that public schools must begin integrating with, quote, all deliberate speed. Still, that phrase was incredibly vague, and most schools kept resisting, dragging their feet with impunity, and in some cases, retaliating by firing Black educators. It was clear that the fight for simple justice was not yet won. Yes, Brown v. Board was a big judicial victory, but the movement faced more legal setbacks in the months to follow, including a completely unfathomable decision by a jury in Mississippi over the killing of a Black teenager. We'll cover that heart-wrenching story in the following chapter of this series, and we'll explore further injustices Black Americans had to endure. Because even after the victory here in Topeka, Kansas, there's no question that there is still much more to overcome.